right. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that's my cue. It's a little strange with no sound, but here we are. Thank you all for joining us for part three in our webinar series, Peer Perspectives on Respite. I am Rosalind Hayes, a person in long-term recovery. I am the Chief Operating Officer for the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network. And what that means is that I continue doing the work that I've done for the majority of the time that I've been with the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network, and that has been working in supporting and overseeing our peer-run respite centers, our peer support wellness and respite centers across the state of Georgia. I am excited about today. We wanted to have panelists from across the country, and when I reached out, the response was immediate, and several people just, yes, I want to be a part of this webinar. Yes, I will support you. And so I do not want to waste any more time talking about me. I want to get on to what we're here to talk about. And that is taking a look at respite centers across the country, what the models are like, what some of the challenges of opening and sustaining respite are like, and how we see the future shaping up for peer-run respites. And with that being said, I have three marvelous guests. I have Sarah, I have Zay, and I have Steve. I'm not going to do last names because I don't want to mess any of them up. So I will allow each of you to please, we'll start with Sarah and go down the line. If you would introduce yourselves and tell us briefly about the work that you do, and then we'll come back around and get into more detail. So Sarah, if you will.
Sure. My name is Sarah Davidow. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been a part of the Wildflower Alliance, formerly known as the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, since before it was funded. It was funded in 2007, and we started the first peer respite in Massachusetts in 2012, which is called AFIA. And AFIA is a 3-bedroom house in Western Massachusetts, and there's lots more to say, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Steve, if you will.
Steve Michia, I'm the CEO of People USA, peer run organization. Been here since 1999. We started the first peer respite back in 2001 and have been operating ever since and helping others open them across the country, which has been wonderful. And I'm sure we have more to talk about as we go further here.
Yes, and Zay, please.
Hi, I'm Zay Okoronta. I use they, them pronouns. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm currently a peer services director at an org called SOAR. So I oversee a peer run respite and a peer run warm line. And I've been in my role for 2 years now. But Solstice House has existed long before me and will continue after me, whenever that is. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you all. So in Georgia, our respite centers, we have each of our centers has 3 bedrooms. People can stay up to 7 nights at a time within our center. We also operate a warm line, and we provide daily wellness activities, just as basics of what we do in our respite centers. People are able to access respite every 30 days. And they come in, we do what we call a proactive conversation, and that kind of gets people eligible to participate in respite. And so I'm curious, I know, like you guys said, there's lots more to say. I think people, if they've been following this respite series, they know a bit about our Georgia model. But I'd love to hear from each of you. And Zay, we'll start with you and go back down the line for some specifics in how your respite center operates.
Yeah, I think our respite is pretty unique. Wisconsin has 5 peer run respites, and we're tied to some state legislation. So we don't bill for Medicaid at this point, and I hope we don't ever. We don't reimburse. And our respite, since they're operated independently, our respite has taken a really clear kind of harm reduction abolitionist perspective. So we welcome people of all walks of life. We do support people who don't have housing, people who use drugs, people who are leaving or facing incarceration of any kind, whether that's institutional, psychiatric. We work with what people are working with. So our goal is like rules should make sense. So if we have a policy that prevents someone from accessing support, we're quite flexible on some of those guidelines, and we look at things on a case-by-case basis. When we look at sanctuary, we do not connect to crisis linkage. We will not like dispatch EMS for any reason. We won't make a decision for and over a person. I think that's hopefully pretty standard in respites. But when we say like we're non-carceral, we mean that really clearly. So unrestricted environment means people can come and go as they please. We're not monitoring people. We're not asked, we have a very low barrier for entry as well. So I think the way that we operate is more based on how do we need to create trust with the person since they're coming into our space. And we look at the first conversation is always just a peer support discussion. Because I think a lot of discussion I've heard is, you know, what do people want from respite, and am I sure they're going to use the respite correctly? And just with our populations, with the disparities in our state, there's a lot of people that don't know what respite is, don't know what peer support is, have no idea of what's available to them. So we try to introduce that to them over the phone. And then a lot of these situations become respite stays. So we're passionate about introducing respite to people who haven't experienced it for the first time. Someone can stay up to 5 nights, and we're looking to center people most impacted by systems. So our staff is about 50 to 75% people of color, if I'm doing math correctly. And then we have lesser, but we're building a queer consensus as well. So I think about 30 to 40% right now. So our community is changing who we serve. The house composition is very different, I think, than what it's been in the past. And we're known as kind of a safe haven where people can come and experience distress without fear of kind of an intervention or something else happening that's not their decision.
Great. Thank you. Sarah, and then we'll follow with Steve.
Well, I love a lot of what Zay said. I don't want to just repeat it. Certainly, I think there's differences between us and where Zay is working, but there's a lot of similarities as well. We talk a lot. We have some 4 core trainings that everyone in our peer respite takes. That includes intentional peer support, alternatives to suicide, hearing voices, and anti-oppression training. And a lot of that is about taking a harm reduction approach to a lot of the things people experience in the world, rather than deciding what the problem is for them and what they need to do about it. I think that's a really fundamental difference between how we operate and how the vast majority of what get called sort of mental health services operate in this state and beyond. We really, really value and center the nature of it being voluntary, everything that we're doing. And so people, like Zay said, can come and go. I know we're going to talk about challenges later on, but I've heard of peer respite setting limitations on that. And I'm always like, well, I don't know if you're actually a peer respite then. Like, it's like, can we talk about that? So it's just so important. And so many people have lost power. And we don't talk about the loss of power enough in society. But so many people have lost power through trauma, through systems. And so we really prioritize sharing power, making sure people retain their own power, and supporting them to figure out how to take some power back. It does get a little tricky in what we offer when we say, like, kind of do what you want, use the spaces you want, because sometimes people are like, I'm used to everyone telling me what to do. And it can actually feel off-putting to some folks. And so we have to be really willing and ready to explore with them what that could possibly look like. And so that is a big part, that exploration, that willingness to talk about anything that applies to someone's life or where they're at, and really explore that and what that sort of freedom to choose and determine their own path can actually look like. Because sometimes people have really only heard one path or maybe a couple of paths if they're lucky. We really prioritize real choice. I think we work in a system where choices have sometimes looked like you can live in that group home or you can have nowhere to live. There's your choice, that sort of choice. And so we are really looking to support people and truly weighing the choices they have that are actual choices and trying to increase the number of choices that are accessible to people. I think that's hard sometimes. And I know we'll get to challenges too, because we're living in this society where people's basic needs aren't being met. And it's really hard when we have to sit with people and say, actually, we don't know of any choices either for some of the things you're facing. And then it becomes that power of connection and being with people, kind of, being willing to sit with people in darkness. We really shift from this idea that we're responsible for to this idea that we're responsible to one another as a community to be with each other in the darkness and kind of figure out what are the ways out of it. So I could keep going and going, but I know you've got lots of questions, so I'm going to let you move on to Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
I'm so excited about what I'm hearing because I really hear no difference in any of the respites that I've been working with or our respite in anything that Sarah said or that Zaya said. So I'm excited to know that there is a fidelity, at least to the base of the model of what we created, and that we're just truly respecting the people we serve in such a way. As Sarah was saying, people often don't know, given the freedom, they don't know what to do. And that's why we created the menu of services that they could choose from. We don't give them, here's what you can do while you're here. It's here's what's available. You pick what you want and you do what you want. And if it's not on the list, you make up what you want. So it's really the freedom of giving those people so many choices. And then hearing, a lot of the testimony we get in each of the houses is that nobody ever treated me this way before. Nobody ever gave me this much power. Nobody ever actually loved me in this way that you do, in this house. And so it changes the paradigm of not just for the individuals that come to stay at our places. It starts to change the system. And that's what I've liked about it, is that other providers, traditional providers, are learning from a system that is harm reduction based and empathy based and mutuality that we provide for one another. It's not changing fast enough because there's still the marginalization and the punitive care that's out there. However, I didn't create it to change the system. I just created it to help people have a better experience when they're in crisis. And the result of it has been these great changes that, well, they're good changes that we're seeing come from, the work that peer services or people with lived experience services are providing. And so it's just exciting to know that this is the way it's growing in our country has just really been a wonderful journey to watch.
Thank you. And with that being said, Steve, I'll stay with you and just talk more about how you've seen respites evolve over time and the emergence of, or the need for, you talked about fidelity to a model, national standards or things of that nature, so that, that fidelity, so that we are able to keep the pureness in respite and have some sort of fidelity to the model.
Yeah, I remember opening the first house. Actually, Sherry Mead was a big part of the conversation because she had a place in New Hampshire when we were first developing this respite that we're talking about today. And we differed on some areas, and she wanted, the way she ran her respite was she wanted to get to know the individual before they had a crisis, and they wouldn't always stay overnight. And it was just a different approach. And I said, no, I really just want people to come to the house and just have a great experience, So I wrote it a little differently. So then I didn't think there would ever be an issue of fidelity or worrying about the standards or anything of that nature, because I didn't know how far this respite thing would go. And to our surprise and pleasure is that it's growing tremendously. And now there is this discussion nationally about, should we have standards? Should we have a baseline of some kind of fidelity, in the model. And it does make sense. It does make sense that we all get together and talk about how we're running the houses and how, what the differences are. But I've seen some evolutions where some houses have just turned into something completely different as well. There were a couple that it became more of a commune setting, and it wasn't any more focused on just the 5-day stay or the 7-day stay. It was more of, you're just here and you can stay. And that became an issue with the state. It made the respite not look so good. So there were issues with that I had to help a couple of different providers, work on those issues. Because I do believe that we do have to follow some kind of a standard to ensure that the reason why the respite was created was to give people an alternative experience that would work with their crisis, within, without, and educate them, give them self-determination, empower them, and provide, lend that vision of hope to everyone we serve. And so that's something that's, near and dear to us, to ensure that we're, at least, going in that direction and having that fidelity to offer that service.
Thank you. And just to be clear, I know, I think Sherry Mead started the first respite and you started the second one. Was Rose House? Is
Rose,
that your?
yeah. The Rose House model is based off of Sherry's. So Sherry had the first, in New Hampshire, like I said, but it was a different, different engagement. It was different, guest experience a little bit. And then, so we were the second.
Yeah, and I know when Georgia got into the mix, there might have been, I know, less than 10, maybe 5 in the country, and now,
there were very few.
Yeah, what would you estimate the number to be across the country at this point?
It's probably closer to 50 now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sarah, same question for you.
Ross, could you just restate the question? I'm sorry, I lost a little of it.
Just thinking about, because I know as much as we have in common, with the way we view this work and approach this work, I know there's lots of conversation now, as respite grows and as respites evolve, and just thinking about over time, what have you seen? And as this emergence, this conversation about national standards and things comes up,
Sure.
How have you seen this evolve over time?
Sure. And, I'd love to say a little bit more about the history too, because it's so important. I have been a part of this project called the Black Movement Leaders Project that I encourage people to look at. I will put the link in the chat in a few minutes. But as a part of that work, I realized, I guess I kind of knew, but I realized even more so how many people were doing little fits and starts of things that just often didn't have the platform to be known about. So I've made it a practice wherever I go to mention Jenny Fulgham, who was in Virginia and started the Zuni Mental Health Federation project on a property that she happened to have that was very similar in its way to peer respite, and that was in the 70s. And so I just want to say that. And I think also, just as we move forward through history, recognizing June Dumont's work, she worked with the Crisis Hostel in Ithaca, New York, which was not a peer respite, but she did a lot of research and it laid the foundation for Sherry's work with Stepping Stone in New Hampshire, and Sherry did that work. And then, of course, as we move on, as Steve has already talked about, AFIA was number 13 when we opened in 2012, and then it's, started to grow faster. And as it's grown, I just, I remember all sorts of different conversations over the years. I remember being on a peer respite call and we were talking about navigating drug use in the spaces, for example. And someone, and I won't get into any details, but someone said, oh, we don't have that issue here because in order to leave the peer respite in this state, you need to be with your case manager. And I was like, uh-oh. I was like, I don't know if that is a peer respite. Can we back up here? And so as we've gone and as different funders have had their hands in things, it's become clear that there was going to be pulls away from fidelity. And sometimes, there needs to be conversations even just within the group of folks who are operating peer respites, who are really invested in them, just so that we make sure, kind of an affinity group conversation, so we make sure that we have had enough space to talk about what we believe it should be, what it should look like, because there's internalized oppression too. And a lot of us come to this work very passionate about it, but not having been supported to unpack what did we pick up along the way as we walk through these oppressive systems, and what might we still need to shed and think through and get creative about. And so there's that piece. Then there's the funder pull I already mentioned. And I think with all of that, and especially as growth speeds up, there's no way that it won't continue to get co-opted if we don't have something to point to. And so there actually is a group that is working that, both Steve and Zay and I have had connections to, and really trying to have this conversation. I know there's been conversation of it before now too, but I think over this next year, I'm really hopeful that we will have more conversation, expand who's involved, and figure out how can we at least have something to point to that is accepted on a national level, so that when a funder comes along and says, we really want to get the credit for having this innovative thing, they don't also redefine what that innovative thing is along the way, because we already have so many system options. We need these to remain what they're intended to be.
Thank you so much. And Zay, would you like to speak to the same question or the same ask, as far as just, how have you seen things evolve over time, and thinking about this need for national standards, and how do, as clinical folks want to operate respite centers, for example, what does it look like? How do we maintain, who we are and what respite was intended to be?
Yeah, so I think, since Solstice House is just so different, I know I hear a lot of it's like similarities, and I feel that in respite spaces, and I still feel like we're coming from such a different place, because just transparently, I'm new to peer support, as of 2 years ago. And before this, most of my work is in movement organizing spaces, transformative justice, things that were peer support adjacent per se. So I don't actually know a lot of the history that people are clued in on. And I was actually always very surprised at the similarities that organically came out of the work we were doing, just based on who works at Solstice House and whether that's a philosophical orientation or a political identity, or a set of lived experiences, just how we inherently know what we need as a community. And how we create those things based on the oppressions and losses of power we've had in systems. So I'm so pleased to see this push toward national standards, and also I don't want it to be in response to what the system is doing about us, but instead of I love the idea of national standards, but sometimes I think I wonder if what it would be like for respites to get real about what do we think the respite's really for? Because something I've pushed back on really openly is the idea that a respite is supposed to do something like promote healing, or something that is supposed to serve as a catalyst for change, or we still want to make sure we're focusing people on pursuing their wellness while they're here. And I see respite as, maybe to what Steve was saying, ours might be considered in that commune realm almost, because people of color and people who are vulnerable to systems need places we can commune and be together without an expectation that I'm doing something or I'm improving myself. So that whole unstructured, creating structure to respond to someone's need for structure, we won't do that. We'll kind of just say, what's it like for someone to not tell you what to do, and how do you want to feel, who do you want to be right now? There's all these choices available. Maybe we just sit here and feel what it's like to not be oppressed by a gaze. Maybe it's just, this is where you can breathe into the scariness that it feels like to be truly in your own authenticity with the freedom, and that freedom feels terrifying, and we can just sit with how scary it is that this just doesn't exist. So when I look at how respites are evolving and the emergence of national standards, I sometimes do see a lot of like subtle move towards co-optation when it's the idea that like respites should be used correctly, or can determine like who's a good fit for a respite or what they should get out of it. I don't think we can see respite, quote unquote, use what it's for unless we invite people to tell us what you think it could do for you. So it's, the whole like, I don't know, when I look at funding, I want to avoid things like Medicaid. I love the legislation we're tied to. We write our own goals, our own objectives. And I think that those things organically come out of respites, like that self-determination, that empowerment, that self-responsibility, that community feeling. But people intuitively create that on their own when they're given the space to just exist and allow others to exist like side by side. So I think our approach is more like hands off. And what we kind of think of is like, what would the system do? And then totally invert that, whether that's a paperwork process, a conversation. We don't do follow-ups. We don't even need someone to tell us that like they want to get healing or they want to feel better. Some people just need to go somewhere without an explanation, and maybe they discover that language or they don't. But I think we need to like reorient ourselves with national standards to really that self-determined meaning. Because if we're looking at people of color, historically disadvantaged groups, people who are layered with identities vulnerable to systems, they don't even know, I don't even know, speaking for myself, what it's like to be in an environment where no one's looking at me, telling me what to do, and to then have that freedom like almost imposed on me, like, actually, we don't do that here. This is the space where you get to make decisions. I just think we lose out on people accessing respite when there's an idea of even my attachment to outcome for the respite as a director, because I don't have an attachment that everyone's going to get along or feel better or get their healing needs met here. I think those things can certainly take place, but I don't claim ownership of those things. I see the respite almost as a space. I don't want us to look at, we're not offering services. We don't have a schedule. We're not offering people a substitution to like soothe that need for structure. We're inviting them to create something totally brand new. And sometimes just that slowness, that stillness that people of color don't get because we're racing against time, we're racing against systems. That slowness to just actually rest is so needed.
Thank you. And I'll come back to you and with this next question. And it's not one that is written down, but it's just something that's come to me as we talk and thinking about funding and the expectations or requirements that sometimes come along with the money. And how do we manage, how do we keep this open space that is, one that promotes self-determination and the opportunity to just be, if that's what is necessary or wanted, or to rest, or just, to not have to be doing something, that would that folks could say, okay, they're working on their wellness. How do we maintain this space and take this money and which might have some requirements that come along with this money?
I like to kind of mirror back, not like to manipulate, but to parrot back the language that SAMHSA says, which is like self-determined health pursuits yield higher outcomes for people. So self-determined health pursuits, meaning like if someone wants to come to Solstice House and we have a woman that comes and likes to bake cakes, and all she wants to do is cook for everybody there. And that's what respite is for her. That's amazing. So when we look at data collection, it's like, did the person feel that they were encouraged to make a self-determined meaning out of their own experiences? Were they invited to revision their own wellness? Did they have freedom of how they chose to spend their time here? Did they feel supported in pursuing the things that felt meaningful for them while they were here? Were they able to find a sense of like community belonging and interconnectedness? Did they feel that things were voluntary, undisturbed? So what we're really measuring is a person's ability to make self-defined and meaningful choices, and then how that's reflected in like how that then connects to other areas of their life. Like if their overall well-being felt amplified because of the freedom of choices or the space and the time to make choices, rather than, what goals are they pursuing or do they feel better? Because that doesn't always happen. If I had 5 days to sit, I might just come to terms that I've been wrestling with grief, and maybe I leave feeling worse, but maybe I leave with a direction and knowing like where I need to go next. all I care about is if someone felt that they were free while they were here. And that looks like different things to everyone.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Sarah, same thing with this, the money tie and how do we maintain our space and take money that might have conditions attached to it.
I mean, sometimes we don't take the money. I think we have to hang on to that. I remember we also at Wildflower, we make films, et cetera. I remember interviewing someone and saying, have you ever felt like you've lost opportunities for sticking to your values? And he said, not opportunities that I'd want. I think that's important. I think that obviously we want these peer respites and so much of what we're doing beyond peer respite as well to be well funded. I would make arguments all day long about how they should get more funding than lots of the more conventional clinical programs that are out there. And yet we often find ourselves fighting for the scraps and thinking if we don't take this, there won't be anything else. And, sometimes I think we've lost stuff because we won't go along with that. But other times we've actually had people approach us and say, we'd like to fund you in some way because we see you sticking to your values. And that's the funding that I want. And, it's really challenging because I want all of this to grow so much more than it has. And yet I do not see growth happening in ways that I want it to be happening, in ways that I think hold to integrity in places where people are making lots of compromises. So there's that. So I think sometimes we say no, and sometimes we have really had to hold a clear line. And we also offer community bridging where we go into jails and psychiatric facilities, et cetera, and try and support people to get out and get connected in the community so they're not back in. And I remember them saying, our funders saying, who was already a funder, they tried to implement a new practice saying, and now you have to take people's real names and write them down on the forms that go back to us. And we said, why? Which is something people don't often ask. Sometimes they just are like, oh, okay, funder asked it, we must do. And we asked why. And what they said back was, well, we want to make sure your employees are actually demonstrating that they're working and not just sitting in their car. And I'm like, well, what makes you think they couldn't make up people's names? Like that's not a reason to violate people's privacy and turn their names over to funders. And so I wrote back a pretty direct email. It resulted in someone coming from Boston 2 hours out to meet with me, and ultimately they didn't take the money away. They let us keep going, and they
Nice.
didn't draw that line. And so I think sometimes we take our own power away by giving in. Where we have had to make concessions, or I shouldn't even say had to, or we chose to make some concessions. For example, we did, as a condition of peer respite, one battle we lost that we decided wasn't a deal breaker was to make sure that people had information about the local crisis services. So what we did was like, well, we're not going to give up a whole contract because they're saying, no, you really have to do that. What we did was we created a handout where we said, here's the local crisis number. And then we put lots of other information on it about what to expect exactly if you call that, and that we will never call it on you. And then we also put lots of information about other things like libraries, et cetera, just in the area to really balance that out. And so, in some ways we decided the way we approached it was a benefit because many people are just given a crisis number and not told what to expect or what they could lose by calling that number. In meeting our funders' requirement, we also ended up giving people more information they need to make real informed consent and real informed decisions. So that's how we tend to approach things when we do decide it's not a deal breaker and we're going to compromise.
Nice. Thank you. And Steve, prior to the start of the webinar, you were talking about you all's win with Medicaid, and I'd love for you to speak to that a bit more when we talk about funding and Medicaid billing. How have you been able to navigate that so that you haven't had to give up any of the values that are so important?
That was an interesting battle in New York because I never wanted Medicaid to be a part of this, and we were just hoping that it would stay away. However, the state will do what it's going to do, and had they just gone ahead and done it, it would have really destroyed the the initial model of respite. And So we got heavily involved in the advocacy and the work around it. And, our houses, since we've gone into Medicaid, are exactly the same as they were from day one. And, as Zay was saying, if they want to come and rest, they rest. If they want to come and do whatever in the houses, they do. Really, these, the houses that we're talking about are more about the relationship and conversation, aren't they? Around the people that we're working with and the people we meet and the people that come and visit us. I always take it from that approach is, your crisis or your situation or whatever it is you're dealing with is yours. And if you want to come into the beautiful home, and share and be a part of that, that's great. If you don't want to share, that's great. I mean, it's just, we've gotten through that difficulty of, all right, well, how do we do this under Medicaid? And again, hiring people that were smarter than me was part of the process, because I didn't know how we were going to do it. And I thought that was going to be the end of, our ride with respites, and it didn't have to be, and it isn't. So, again, everything that Sarah and Say are talking about are just, still exist the same way in the houses. The only thing is that there is documentation that has to be done, but it's not a thing of you need to do this or you have to have, certain criteria met. Isn't a barrier, isn't a situation that we're dealing with. It's just another way of us capturing monies so that I can pay my staff well, because they work really hard. Many of the staff that we hire are former guests as well, and I'm sure they are for you too, where they've gotten such a great experience out of it that they want to be a part of that. And that's wonderful. They are some of the best staff you could ask for. So, to us, it came down to, these should be everywhere. Respites should be everywhere. They should be run the way they're run. We should, again, have that national base standard, but you're gonna run them different no matter where you are in the country anyway. You're gonna be conducive to the culture of your community. You have to be. So you're not compromising that when you, at least in New York, since we've gone to that Medicaid billing. So it was a challenge. It was really frustrating, but it was a couple of years of hard work to get through it all.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
And I'm curious, some of what I find difficult or challenging here in Georgia is really conveying the idea of respite, what it is that we're there to do, the way that we're there to support people and be with people as they, work through what it is that they want and need, and as they determine what it is and how it is that they want their stay to be. And I'm curious if staffing has been, I hear you speaking to it, Steve, and it sounds like, staffing hasn't been much of a challenge for you, but I'm just curious about staffing and really getting staff on board with, with like we use intentional peer support, and oftentimes there's like a resistance to that model, and how we get that across to folks and really work with staff so that they are able to work with the people who come into respite in the way that allows those kinds of opportunities for self-discovery. And I'm curious if anybody, if any one of you would like to speak to that, or if that's been a challenge that you all have had to deal with.
So if I understood correctly, you're asking about how do we build our teams and how do we?
Yes.
I mean, what I will say is that one of the ways that we've been successful in building our team is to not pay any attention or very minimal attention anyway to things like state certifications for peer support and all that. We don't look at schooling at all or certifications programs at all. If people have been through some of our trainings that we're going to offer them when it comes to the peer respite, that's useful because it gives them a reference point. But we are looking for a spark and a certain creativity in when we interview people. And so we ask a lot of scenario questions, things like that, when people come in, to try and get a sense of what's their starting point and how much they need to unlearn, because unlearning is harder than learning. And if they're coming with lots of preconceived notions about what peer support looks like or what help looks like, then that's going to be harder than if they just really have a passion and some general like kind of gut sense of where to go with things. And following that, it certainly hasn't been perfect. Sometimes we have found that coworkers are much nastier to each other. Like, it's harder to get people to use some of the ways we do train people to interact with each other rather than people they support, and that leads to some challenges at times. So it hasn't been perfect always, but by following that general principle, we've been pretty successful at finding people. And sometimes it's people who've had deep experiences in the system, and I think that's really important, because that level of loss of power is not something that you can learn. But that loss of power could happen in jails and prisons. It could happen all over the place. So being creative, what that looks like, but also people who've avoided the systems entirely. Because if we get too rigid in how we're building our team, then the stories get too similar, which isn't always useful. And we also miss huge swaths of community who've had access or lack of access to different things.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Zay, would you like to speak to the team building aspect?
Yeah, I think first of all, just like dumb luck has been like something that I can't take credit for all of it, but I think yeah, I actually look for people that are not certified. I look for people that don't have peer support experience, and I look for people that don't have a whole lot of education. I find that people who have carceral backgrounds really get what we mean by unrestricted, non-carceral. Rules need to make sense. And some of that can also be healing by way of just doing the work. Certainly, like Sarah said, looking for people with experiences of loss of power in systems, but then looking like for people like myself, like Sarah was saying, because I'm somebody who I've never successfully been put on a full psychiatric hospitalization, just some temp holds, and looking for people that are already skilled in self-navigation, people who have been forced to navigate distress independently and already authentically know what it means to avoid systems deliberately because they're harmful, and have created intuitive grassroots systems for themselves, or a self-navigation style that works for them. I also don't necessarily look for people that are familiar with peer support world, know anything about it, because I've seen in peer support a lot of that internalized systems attitudes, and like even like the badge of honor we wear as like, I'm a survivor and I identify as a psych survivor, but the credibility that's lent to people because of those harrowing experiences, then sometimes being an opening for them to be replicated as like subconscious harm that like maybe I'm not fully aware of some of the things and how that's translated into my attitudes about other people. So I look for people that don't even have necessarily peer support skills, but repair skills. Coming from a transformative restorative justice background, I look for flexibility, openness, willing to pivot, someone who's compassionate enough to say I made a mistake, a self-attunement to my own needs, accountability when I make a misstep, the willingness to face challenging conversations, because I think peer support has an insular culture too, where it's like, nobody get uncomfortable, don't open up the trauma, don't, we're afraid of conflict. And I think we put on the kid gloves and make it a trigger-free environment, instead of realizing that historically communities, especially people who are disenfranchised by systems, we have to get along together if we're going to avoid things like the police. So we have to work shit out. So I handle it at Solstice House like we'd handle it at a community barbecue or like my family event. What can the police do that we can't do together? And I look for people that understand the creativity, the humility, the willingness to make space for other people, the commitment to remaining in togetherness and community because we need each other. That's for me, I think the hallmark is someone that says like, I'm here for all of it, no matter how dirty, how messy, how gritty it gets. I'm going to own my shit, invite people to own their shit. And then, forgiveness, repair, those things might look like cooking for each other, walking, or just sitting in the discomfort that we're not all the same. So I just look for people that have the relational skills to stay with things when they're difficult and can see opportunity that arise out of challenge or disconnection, because that's how I think we have to work with peers. So how we work with each other is how we work with the peers. And usually there's just, I like the question we always get is like, do you work here? Like, I think I hear that question like 10 times a day. So I'm at the house 3 days a week. And when we no longer can differentiate between the staff and the guests, that's when we know we're on a roll. That's where we're at right now.
That's awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thinking about just challenges and concerns, I was curious just about, as the desire for respites grows. What are some of the challenges that you see arising? What are some of the concerns that you have? Political, funding, or otherwise? Just what are some of the things that you see that could be, could throw up some roadblocks or some real bumps in the road?
There's
And
many challenges.
go ahead,
There's
Steve. I was going to say,
no-
start. Go ahead, Steve.
There's no question that there's many challenges. A lot of people, when we find houses, and I know across the nation this happens, you have to go through zoning boards and planning boards and all this stigma and discrimination and ignorance and whatever, and try to explain these things to them, that these are going to be, wonderful places for people to be. That's a big challenge, for a lot of folks. Of course, the funding is always there. It's how to get the dollars or the operations to actually do it. That's another big challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges when I first started, because I didn't know what peer support was when I first got into this whole world, and when I started to understand it and go to meetings and meet with large groups of different people with lived experience, and I found that we eat our own. We're not always nice to one another, and we're not always very fair with one another. And I think that is also a challenge, as things grow and things like this start to, spark life into something that is good for our communities. So I think navigating that can be a challenge for people too. I think many times respites that I've spoken to feel like they're on an island all alone. And that's, I don't think we need to be. I think we can really work. There's no issue with working together and having different opinions and values to some extent. But again, sticking with the core of, what we're here for is important to remember. But so that, there's challenges everywhere you go.
Yeah, and the NIMBYism is still that's such, the stigma is still such a huge barrier, and the Not in My Backyard Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network, with opening our peer support and wellness centers, it's something that we continue to face. We find a house, and folks are, yes, we'll rent you this property or what have you, and then when they find out what we're going to use it for, the hearts and minds change. In Decatur, we were taken to court, and they were going to shut us down, and it got really, really ugly. They were taking video of us and posting it on online and everything, and we were pedophiles and all of these kinds of things, just all these horrible names and things, and we were able to win the lawsuit and stay in place, and over time we became named the neighborhood safe house. And so we went from being, the house of pedophiles to being the neighborhood safe house. And so, doing good work and really supporting people, it speaks for itself. And the neighborhood was able to see that. Those hearts and minds change, but it is something that is still a big challenge. Anybody else? Sarah, do you want to speak to the challenges and concerns that you see? And then we will wrap up with just like, what do you think the future looks like for peer run respites?
Yeah, so as Steve said, I think there's many challenges. One of them is that sometimes we are funded to not be able to demonstrate our usefulness, because, for example, here in Massachusetts, part of the idea was we were supporting people who wanted to avoid psychiatric facilities. and other carceral settings, and yet a 3-bedroom house that can have 3 people staying at one time in a sea of psychiatric units and other invasive interventions doesn't, we're full all the time. So they need to fund us enough so that we have the potential to actually have the space to meet the demand so that we can demonstrate what we do. And sometimes I think there's some intentionality in just saying like, nope, we'll give them a little bit so they stop, but we're not going to give them enough to actually prove their value. And I think, it's just really hard. And I think that we're also existing in a time when, if anything, discrimination and psychiatric oppression is increasing. And we're watching the New York mayor say, yeah, just like round everyone up. That's okay. We'll take their rights. And in this state, involuntary outpatient commitment is being pushed again. We're one of the only states that doesn't have involuntary outpatient commitment, more commonly understood as assisted outpatient treatment, or AOT, and trying to push back on that and talk about the value of voluntary supports is really, really hard. And I think sometimes we are creating our own challenges by promoting ourselves as cost savings. I do think cost savings is important, but I also think that this is a really hard job to find people who really want to do it well and stick with it. And if we're paying them not a living wage because we've promoted ourselves as cost savings, and sometimes we're undercutting ourselves. And I'll stop because I know we're almost out of time.
Thank you. Yeah, we have 4 minutes left. And so just quickly, I'll give a last word. I'll start with you, Zay, and we'll just go through and the question is what does the future and your estimation look like for peer run respites?
I can't say about the future for peer respites, but I'll speak to the challenge and like my future quickly, because Sarah, your answer kind of led to my response to both of those things. I think the challenge is in representation of people designing, leading respites, and leading the creation of national standards. I think we have a gap in equity in the respite workforce and the peer support workforce. And I think we're losing out on a huge population of people that have inherently been doing this work, that are harm reductionists, drug users, sex workers, people that have created informal networks of support, that are skilled in doing these things in mutual aid networks and community organizing. I think that is some of the gap. And depending on where the co-optation lands and where the chips fall, it's going to determine ultimately if people like me are still in respites. So I'll say the work will continue happening whether or not it looks like peer run respite. It's up to us as a workforce to engage people who are on the ground, who represent the communities that need this the most, and keep our lens. And like, maybe just because of the way things came to be, we haven't been connected to those communities. There are people who are waiting to lead some of these things that can show us. But I think the way things have been done historically and the standstill people are at is because the people who need respites look different than the people who have seeded and created respites. And the reality is that the political vulnerabilities, they're equipped to teach us, we're equipped to teach y'all how to do some of that work. So the future of respites, I think, looks undetermined, but I think the community of respites has to change to vision a new future as the world is changing, which looks like people of color, non-binary people, people with disabilities, people who are most impacted by systems leading the things that we need, or we will become crisis respites, and we'll continue to do the work, and it just won't be called peer respite anymore. It'll just be called abolition.
Thank you. Steve, last word. What does the future look like?
I think the future is bright, and I do agree there needs to be that diversity and inclusion of everyone. We have a new population of people that we're working with as well, where many of us that were in institutions or in psychiatric, locked units and whatever is much less than it used to be. So you're dealing with entirely different population of people. And if you don't evolve with it, then history is going to repeat itself and it's going to fall apart. So we need to be open to the changes, in our world. But it's a bright future.
Thank you all so much. Our final in this series is on August 7th, and it is entitled "What's Next?" I'll be reaching out to some of you guys to see if you want to come back and continue the conversation. Thank you all for being here. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.